Well, last Sunday, we were in John chapter 13 and heard the story of Jesus washing the feet of the disciples and giving them the command to love one another and serve the world in a similarly humble manner. We saw Jesus live out a love that was meant to be a forever love, a love that would transform the world. These things unfolded over the course of John's account of what we know as Maundy Thursday. But where the other Gospels give us the institution of the Eucharist taking place at this time, John gives us something else. Over the 5 chapters that bridge the gap between last week's lesson and this week's, Jesus offers the farewell discourse, an image of Jesus as the vine and the disciples as the branches, a promise of the Holy Spirit being poured out upon them as an advocate, as a helper in the movement to come, a return to the vine image to show himself as the source of life, preparation for the world's hatred of them, and finally his extended farewell prayer. Unfortunately, we skipped over all of these chapters to get to this week's lesson. So my encouragement to you is to bookmark these chapters here in John, chapters 13 to 17. And I encourage you to visit them during Holy Week. Spend some time reflecting on this important conversation from Monday to Wednesday of Holy Week before we move into the great Triduum of Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, and Easter Vigil. Because while tremendous narrative space in John is given to this discourse, it really only covers a short period of time. So now we find ourselves in chapter 18, where the 12 verses that precede our lesson today, we hear of Jesus being arrested in the garden. Now, right after last week's lesson, there are 2 tense moments, as Jesus first looks to Judas and says, "Do quickly what you are going to do." It is then that Judas leaves to betray Jesus to the authorities. The events that will lead to Christ's crucifixion are now in motion. And after Judas departs, wanting to justify himself, Peter attempts to offer a grand statement of faith, saying that he will lay down his life for Jesus. But Jesus answered, "Will you lay down your life for me? Very truly I tell you, before the cock crows, you will have denied me 3 times." So as chapter 18 opens in the garden, a defiant Peter shows that he's ready to fight. The soldiers and the police of the temple, led by Judas Iscariot, arrive at the garden to arrest Jesus. Once again, Jesus, the Good Shepherd, stands as a gate before the danger and shows us what it means to lay down your life for the sheep. He freely offers himself up to the soldiers and tells them to let his disciples go. The disciples are safe. But it's in that moment that Peter decides to strike. Ignoring the lessons of love and mercy that Jesus has just spent the last 5 chapters laying out over dinner, Peter draws his sword and strikes the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Jesus tells him to put his sword away, saying, "Am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given me?" So today's lesson sees Jesus surrendering into custody, but it's important that we note that his disciples were able to leave. In this, we see that he is calling on them to trust him, to trust that the promises he has just laid out will come true, and that he is who he says he is. The disciples are meant to go home, to trust, to believe, and to live to follow another day. Peter and another disciple choose not to do this. So while Jesus is dragged before the high priest for trial, outside the gate, Peter stands trial too. While Peter has already shown his willingness to fight, he moves now to a covert place, warming himself by the fire from the night chill while Jesus is interrogated. But even here, a woman questions Peter, asking, "You are not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" Brazen Peter, so willing to draw his sword a moment ago, falters. After following Jesus, who again and again identifies himself with the divine I am statements that harken back to God's given name to Moses in the wilderness, Peter is given his chance to proclaim who he is and says, I am not. Given the choice, Peter flees from his calling. It's important to note that Peter does not deny Jesus, nor his divinity, nor anything that Christ has done. In the midst of Peter's own trial here by the charcoal fire, Peter denies himself. He denies his calling and his place as a disciple of Christ. It's a fascinating turn of events from the garden to the charcoal fire. When Peter feels safe behind Jesus, he becomes aggressive and violent. When he feels vulnerable, he denies his discipleship. In a way, Peter's life here is held up as a mirror to each of us who have lived alongside Jesus' story this far, seeming to ask, are you a fighter for Jesus or a follower of Jesus? It's the question that surrounds Peter in this scene. He's willing to fight and to be strong for Jesus, but around the fire, he is unwilling to be vulnerable for him. This is the calling that Christ has for our lives, as he is the one who's called us to a way of love and life through the call to humble service, to feel, not to fight or flee. But honestly, Peter's response, biologically speaking, makes perfect sense. It's fight or flight. It's the most basic human response to great stress and danger for the purpose of self-preservation. These two choices are hardwired into our biology, fight or flight. As Christ was fully human as well as fully divine, it would make sense that biologically Jesus would have been bound to these same two responses that Peter was. So together their choices are on trial. Fight. To take on Rome and the religious authorities. Bring about violent revolution to seat Jesus as the king over his kingdom in this world. By worldly standards, that would make sense. And safe behind Jesus in the garden, Peter was willing to follow in this way. Even if Jesus didn't resort to violence, he could use his words to fight. He is the Word. He could offer up answers, outsmart his captors, turn the tables on them like he's done so many times before. Jesus, of all people, could talk his way out of crucifixion, right? It would make sense to fight. But as his trial unfolds in this chapter, as he's questioned by the high priest, he doesn't do this. He doesn't use his words to fight. He doesn't make the high priest's case easy for him either. He reminds the priest that he has spoken openly, that the story belongs to the people now, and that the priest should just ask any of those who heard him to share what he said. This isn't fighting. And it's not flight either, which would also make sense. Jesus could run away. He could run far away. He could take his message personally to India or to the east. He could run back to Egypt, like Matthew recorded that his family did this when there was danger in the days after he was born and Herod sought to kill him. He was facing death, so it would have made sense to run. It made sense to Peter, switching quickly from his defiant fight sense in the garden. When pressed and vulnerable, Peter wishes to flee from who he is. Again and again and again, he denies that he is a follower of Christ. Again and again and again, he flees in his heart and mind from the calling at hand. Fight or flight, the most human responses of self-preservation. Instead, where Jesus failed 3 times, Jesus chose a third way. He showed the world a third path in the face of systems of sin, injustice, fear, and death. He showed God's people what God's path would be in response to our violent justice. He showed the way to transcend our own biology of self-preservation and chooses to work instead for community preservation, for the work of salvation. Jesus chooses to follow. It takes a seemingly irrational response to deny our human biology. Fight or flight, overcome by the call to follow. He chooses to follow in the way of love and hope, even if that path set him on a collision course with the cross. Christ's invitation for the disciples to go home was not an invitation to flee, as it may seem at first glance. It was an invitation to follow Christ in the way of trust, in the way of resurrection life, which he promised. Yet Peter failed. He was more than willing to fight for Christ. He was quick to run from Christ, but he faltered in the call to follow. But I'm not sure that this is just some great moral failing by Peter. It takes faith to follow. It takes love to follow. We cannot manufacture this faith and love. It is a gift of God, a fruit of the tree of life that is the cross of Christ. This is a fruit of the resurrection life that Christ has won for us through the path of death and life that he chose to follow. Peter hadn't seen this yet, but he gets the chance at redemption later in the story. After Easter, we'll hear from John chapter 21, where Peter's threefold denial around the charcoal fire is overcome by his threefold confession by the breakfast fire on the beach with the resurrected Christ. It is resurrection life that inspires this transcendence of our biology to not just fight for our faith at the expense of others or flee from our call in fear, but to follow in the way that promises no safety or security, but promises instead a way of hope and love that transcends the power of death. It is easy for us to pick fighting words for our faith, to pick fights and drag others down based on our principled stands for what we think is right. It's easy as well to run, to refuse to allow ourselves to care and be vulnerable when others are suffering and hurting and are in need of our love. It's easier to pay lip service to causes of equity and justice, yet flee when it comes time to grow and change. It's a harder thing to stay and hope and follow. We can't do this alone. It's why we gather in community to hear again the story of hope and salvation. It's why we are washed to death and back to life again through the waters of baptism with a call to care for one another. It's why we gather with the saints at the feast of everlasting life. These things weave us back into the fabric of hope and peace. Lone threads are prone to knotting and fraying, but threads that follow the weaver's hand come together to be something greater, something stronger, something that can provide care and warmth to those who dwell in fear. Peter's story of denial is a call for each of us to consider where the world is worn and threadbare and what our response will be to the needs around us. There is a calling of love that is woven deep into our hearts and a gift of grace that is being poured out on us day by day. What will be our choice before the cock crows? Will we fight, flee, or follow? Through grace, Christ has provided us hope that sustains the third way, a way that transcends our biology to live abundantly for others rather than just for ourselves. I pray that as we hear this story, we have the peace and assurance through this word and through this community to weave ourselves into the way of Christ's followers, working for peace, hope, and justice in all the earth. Amen.